Welcome to On the Level, broadcasting from the Blue Ocean Network studios here in Beijing. My name is Fergus Thompson. Now, since the establishment of diplomatic ties between the United States and China following President Richard Nixon's historic visit in 1972, relations between the two countries have, of course, improved immeasurably. But it has had its ups and downs. Over the decades, various mechanisms have been used to build confidence and trust between the two sides, or indeed sometimes to diffuse tensions. Most of these tend to be top-down affairs hatched by civil servants, diplomats, policy think tanks as well. But perhaps just as important to the shared future of the United States and China are the myriad personal relationships forged between individual Chinese and Americans. And these can often lead to initiatives at a much more personal level which can help Chinese and American people both learn from and trust one another. One of my guests for today's episode of On the Level are a couple behind one initiative, training educators from across rural China to teach English better. They are Frank Kehl. Welcome to On the Level, Frank.
Thank you.
Dorothy Kehl.
Hi.
Welcome to On the Level.
Thank you.
Now, as I mentioned, this project that you both have been involved in for almost a decade is to improve the teaching of English in rural China. You didn't wake up one morning and say, we're going to train teachers in China. So your relationship, both of you, with China goes back a lot longer than that. Frank, tell us a little bit about it. I mean, what drew you to Chinese and China in the first place?
It was the era of the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps didn't have a program in China. My college was just initiating something called Dartmouth Project Asia. I applied to go to Hong Kong and was accepted. And so I went out in September of 1962, right after my June graduation, and I'm sitting in my office with the other young American teachers, and one of my older colleagues walks in with his favorite student who had just graduated the same June before and who happened to be a valedictorian. And so he was showing her off as one of the fine products of the college that the English department had produced.
Cue Dorothy. Yeah. You were obviously, as we can understand that, originally from Hong Kong.
Yeah, I was born and brought up and educated in Hong Kong. The day that Frank described was called Founder's Day, and I went back to visit my old professors. And in the department office, I met this young American.
Well, you did go back to the United States, and you were both in the United States at a key time, and we were talking about the late 60s, early 70s. You ended up, Frank, in fact, both of you ended up visiting China at a key moment in its history. That was in 1971, when, as I mentioned, just before Richard Nixon's visit. How did that come about? How did you, both of you, get to be in the Great Hall of the People, meeting people like Zhou Enlai, the Premier at the time? We
were part of a group of anti-Vietnam War Americans who were scholars doing research in Hong Kong. And we became friends with what are called the patriotics in Hong Kong. The thing we had in common was that neither they nor we were in favor of the American war in Vietnam. And the relationships developed. And then we were always looking for an opportunity to go to China. And one day, one of the people, I believe from the Daogong Bao, came in and said, would you like to go to China? Everybody said yes. And the person from the patriotic side said, well, you have to apply. And we sort of laughed and said, is that the way you do it?
Right, because you should point out, this time, Americans did not go to China.
Exactly.
There had been no scholars in China since 1949, and we're talking now spring of 71. That then led to a formal invitation, and about 2 months before we made our entry, the American table tennis team was invited. So they were there in April of 71. We arrived in July for a 1-month visit, and our visit was shifted when we arrived in Beijing. We learned later because Henry Kissinger was expected secretly. So while he was in Beijing, we were off in Dajai and Xi'an and Yan'an. And then when we returned, about 2 days later, it was announced to the world that Premier Zhou had talked with National Security Advisor Kissinger, and President Nixon would come to China within the year. And then just 2 days later, we were invited to meet with Zhou Enlai in the Great Hall of the People, approximately a dozen of us.
Mm-hmm. We have a picture of both of you here greeting Premier Zhou Enlai. We should point out Zhou Enlai is a big deal in China. Somebody who is not only respected as a leader, but inspires genuine affection amongst most Chinese. Dorothy, that visit for you, that visit with Zhou Enlai, you came from Hong Kong. Now, this was a place at the time separate from China, under British rule, a place where some people feared an invasion in some cases imminently. What was it like for you meeting this leader from the other side of the border?
Right, you put it very aptly. Growing up, I was thoroughly brainwashed by the colonial education that I had, so that anything that had to do with the mainland China was a taboo. You know, don't have any connection with anything on the left, because that's going to ruin your chance for a job, your chance to go overseas. So under that atmosphere, I knew nothing about the great changes on the mainland. And when I had a chance to visit in '71, together with Frank and the other American scholars, my eyes were opened for the first time. So for me, it was a very emotional and eye-opening trip. And having a chance to meet the great premier, I might say that it really changed the rest of my life. Mm-hmm. So I got involved in community work. We established a cultural organization called the New York Chinese Cultural Center. So through the year, on major holidays like October 1st, Lunar New Year celebration, we would have stage performances, and we mount pictures so that people had the opportunity to come to look at China. And before that, there was a lot of misunderstanding China. The Chinese image for a lot of ordinary American was that the Chinese smoke opium, they gamble, the Fu Manchu and the Charlie Chan image. And we thought we got to erase that.
Well, you both returned to careers. Frank, you were involved in academia and City University of New York, and Dorothy, you were teaching. But through that period, you maintained these links with China, and you also maintained that sort of go-between between Chinese and American people. Is that right? Mm-hmm.
At the City University, I, in essence, became the point person for almost every formal City University exchange with the People's Republic. The very first was introducing the Chancellor of the City University of New York, it's like a president, to the Vice President of Shenzhen University.
So these connections and these sort of go-between events continued, but then when retiring, at the time when people are thinking of heading off to Florida or Miami in the typical way, instead of that, you set up a training initiative in China for teachers in the countryside. Now, Dorothy, you had an English teaching background, obviously, so this is sort of your professional area.
Right.
Just give us an idea of how did this start, and what did this project involve?
Right. Well, while Frank was making all those trips back and forth between the U.S. and China, I basically stayed home. I was a working mom. So I always thought one day I would like to go to work in China and live in China for a year or two so that I can experience what life is like. But then in 2006, yes, I was asked if I would join a group of teachers to go to Guizhou to train English teachers.
This is a remote and poor area of China.
Right, yeah. The foundation that sponsored the program wanted very much to involve teachers from the rural area, from the mountain villages, people who had no exposure to native speakers of English, and particularly involve minority teachers.
And just give us an idea of, for people who might not be able to picture this, the challenges that face teachers in these remote areas.
Right. These teachers typically were taught by Chinese teachers, and the teaching was not done in English, the direct method that we talk about in Hong Kong and the United States, but rather they use Chinese to explain English. Mm-hmm. And they love to teach grammar rules, and you know, it's very hard to break that habit. And my conclusion is that this method of teaching is creating a lot of problems. And they themselves call it 哑巴英语, that is English for the mute. That is, you understand the rule, you can read somewhat, you can write a little bit, but your listening skill is very, very low, and the speaking skill is close to zero. So faced with this kind of teachers from the rural area in that first training program that I got involved in 2006, I didn't know what to do. And so we scratched our heads and decided that, well, these are adults, and they've been through college in China and they're teaching this language. So why don't I try to, you know, let them read something and understand what the meaning is behind this language, English, and let the intellectual interest stimulate them.
You're introducing a new kind of teaching to these teachers, very different to what they were exposed to during their time in college. Mm-hmm. But it's presumably not just the two of you involved in this. So how does it actually work on a basis when you're going to a new city? Because you're going to different places each year.
Yeah, at a certain point, Dorothy teamed up with another two teachers, one of whom had actually been her colleague in the English department at Hong Kong University many years before. And the third person was a retired middle school principal from Hong Kong, who himself was a specialist in English. And on his retirement, he had been traveling around China teaching. He eventually got some foundations in Hong Kong, initially the Suyuan Foundation, then the Candlelight Foundation, this most recent experience in Ankang in Shanxi, mm-hmm. the Zhou Dafu Foundation, to support a program that would involve anywhere from a dozen to a dozen and a half trainers, all of whom were either English fluent or native speakers, Hong Kong, North America, and a little bit everywhere else in the English-speaking world, to come and volunteer for, in essence, 2 weeks during the summer to teach with a very good ratio of teachers to students, roughly 1 teacher trainer to 8 trainees, mm-hmm. something that the Chinese system otherwise doesn't allow for. The typical pattern is 1 teacher, 80 students. Right. Mm. And you can imagine the difficulty in teaching any language with that kind of ratio.
So how many students or trainees are you talking about in these courses?
Any summer, I think, is either between 100 and 150, mm-hmm. but maintaining that same ratio. Mm-hmm. And we use a variety of methods that have proven very effective in a number of different ways. So we do morning lessons. Those include doing dialogues, for example, that they create themselves and then act them out. So they get the process of writing the dialogue, creating a little drama, and acting it out, where we get the opportunity to improve their pronunciation. In the afternoon, after a little siesta and people are a little sleepy, we have singing. And this is all English songs, folk songs, and popular songs, presented by PowerPoint, with the focus on the sounds that are difficult for Chinese speakers. And then after that, we have a film. Before the film, we have discussions on what the film is about. After the film, we have discussions on how much they understood of it. And then, in addition, we do things like free-form conversations. So the day is packed from 8:30 to 11:30, and then 2 to 5:30. But it's not burdensome. On the contrary, the teachers tell us that learning is relaxing, and yet it is very intensive learning, because we keep things moving, we keep things varied, we use linguistic components and cultural components, and truly games, children's songs. We have a lot of fun.
100 to 200 sounds quite a lot, but this is out of hundreds of thousands of teachers in rural China. You couldn't necessarily only come across or be face to face with a few of these. Dorothy, is there any possibility of this expanding? Do these trainees go back, and can they pass this knowledge on? Because this is something quite new for many teachers.
Well, it's our hope that they will share what they learn with their colleagues. It's true that the teachers that we get to work with is only a very small portion of the population of teachers in any area that we go to. However, we hope that more groups will do similar programs so that more teachers will get the chance to participate in.
Do you actively promote this when you're back home in the United States and talk to other people about perhaps doing a similar job in different places?
The way it works is that the recruitment, the organization is done out of Hong Kong. We in America will try to interest our colleagues and friends. So for example, one semester I brought a colleague from the English department at my college, and then one student who took a course with me heard about the opportunity, and it was her plan to become an English teacher in China. So I said, come along and find out what it's like, and then from there on. So this is past summer is her third summer participating. After she got her BA, she got her MA, and her plan is to go and teach in a rural area in China.
But there are also challenges because a rural kid who is being raised by his grandparents, who are semi-literate because his parents have gone to the coast to work, 80 of them in one classroom taught by one of the teachers that we're training, and without any necessity at the moment to learn English, that's a tough bunch of 80 kids to handle. On the other hand, in order to make progress both individually and nationally, there is unquestionably a necessity for learning English.
Do you ever have, maybe amongst neighbours back home in New York, conversations, and they will say to you, well, we've got kids here in New York who are doing badly in school and need somebody to help them out. Why are you going to the other side of the world to teach people in rural China? How do you answer that?
Well, we know, our friends know that in America you have issues in education, but they never challenge us that we run away and do things overseas and not do anything locally, because, well, you know, before retirement we had our own work, but now after retirement we do this because this is something that we believe in, and it's something worthwhile doing.
And I would add that Dorothy, after retirement, because she couldn't retire, started a small program in New York's Chinatown for Chinese adults who wanted to learn English. So that's part of her answer.
This is something that has really taken up all of your professional lives, this going back and forwards between China and the United States and this linking of the peoples. How do you both feel about relations between these two countries now? We're in 2014. It seems to be, I said there were ups and downs earlier, a bit more antagonistic at the moment. Are you hopeful for the future, for the next 10 years? Frank?
I guess I'm always hopeful, just because of my nature. But I also have a little experience that in 1971, when we went and spoke with Zhou Enlai, it was the middle of the Cultural Revolution, and China itself was going through incredible contortions and disruptions. But the fact that we were there then, after more than 20 years of no Americans, or practically no Americans being there at all, that was monumental. Later, in the late 80s, there was another crisis, and what had been an upswing of US-China exchanges just plummeted. Mm-hmm. It took 5 years for that to get partially back. Most recently, we see mutual accusations at the government level of spying. And the US media, up to very recently, in fact, just a little more than a year ago, it was only the Chinese who were spying on the US. But with the Snowden revelations, we see that the spying by the US quantitatively exceeded whatever was going on. I'm not taking a position on spying one way or the other, simply that the media itself sets a tone. And
it does on both sides, to be fair.
And, oh, absolutely. But up until very recently, the US media did not recognize that the US spying on China was minimally the equal. It's the minimum, you could say. So a lot depends on how the media is playing the relationship.
Over this time.
But on the other side, there is no question that Chinese investment in the United States is on the rise. And it's on the rise in almost every sector, with perhaps the exception up to now in the IT category. If both sides are willing to open up, we're talking here business deals, but if they take away the protectionism, if they take away the unnecessary regulatory fear of the other, and here again we're talking both sides, but if you do that, blossoming of mergers and mutual investment and so forth. So that is a big trend. Also, the language teachers in America are making a big push for Chinese to be taught in the schools. And I hear more and more of my colleagues' children, my doctors' children, learning Chinese in their schools.
Dorothy, you're dealing with people,
right.
People here in China and people in New York. From your point of view, somebody who spent half their life growing up in China and then a lot of their life in the United States, what is it that Chinese people, the teachers that you're dealing with, what do you think is the most important thing that they need to know, to find out, to learn about Americans, American people?
The teachers in America, I think that in general, American travel, read, and they don't take the everything the mass media present to them completely. They filter, and they know that certain things are propaganda. And I was just thinking that there are so many students studying overseas, Chinese students. In New York City, the number of people, the Chinese students around where we live, Columbia University, and from reading about the number of students who go to Australia, Canada, England, and to the United States, it's on the rise every day, and there are all kinds of services preparing them and their parents to adjust to their new academic life in the United States or in English-speaking areas. I think that as more people come and understand the Western world, in this case the United States, and when they return to take up different positions in China, there has to be a blossoming of understanding.
There's another aspect. Over 80,000 young Chinese girls have been adopted by American parents. The main organization responsible for that is called Families with Children from China. Those families have come, not at 80,000 worth of them, but many in New York, to the
New York Chinese Cultural
Center that Dorothy was one of the creators of and a longtime board member and actually dancer also. And those people have, by and large, a desire that their daughters, their Chinese daughters, understand their Chinese culture, even as they are thoroughly integrated into American life. And that's a possibility, being bilingual, being bicultural. It's an enrichment, and it's something that I think such parents should strive for.
And what one thing do you think you, as an American, feel that Americans need to know about their counterparts in China?
What one thing? Tough question. Tough question. That, first of all, things in China are changing. Many cultural items are now quite familiar to Chinese at every level, in every sector. We were out at the Olympic site today, and on a lot of the tables where food is sold, we saw yogurt bottles. Now, we years ago learned that the Chinese don't like milk, are lactose intolerant, etc., etc., etc. You would not believe that based on the number of yogurt bottles we saw finished out on tables. So a lot of things change, and that's both a change of practice and culture, and it's also a change in understanding more deeply that the so-called rules of old, the culture of old, is not so rigid. The other side is that there's a need for Americans to understand a pride on the part of Chinese in the fact that their country has become the #2 economy in the world, that their country has a role to play in global affairs, that historical figures such as the general, and you're going to remember his name for me because I've forgotten it, sailed with a fleet of 1,000 ships, Zheng He, to the east coast of Africa, around the time of Columbus. I think a little bit before Columbus. So that there's a pride in that history. We visited Xi'an. Before I left New York, one of my Chinese colleagues wrote down on my pad 2 kinds of things that we should eat while we were in Xi'an. One of them he referred to as a Chinese hamburger, which was excellent, which we ate. But the other thing he said was that he would like to die in Xi'an. And I quizzed him on that. Why? He was a young man. He was talking about culture, not his death. And what he said was that there's so much history in Xi'an that is Chinese history. And in fact, one of the taxi drivers in Xi'an said, "Oh, you're going to Beijing? Well, Beijing is good if you're interested in the last 600 years of Chinese history. Here in Xi'an, we have the last 5,000 years."
Well, I asked you for one, but you gave me several. Frank Kehl, Dorothy Kehl, thank you very much for coming on The Level.